I want to make one thing very clear before I tell this story. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. I don't mess with anything that could alter my perception of reality. I live a very uneventful, straight-edge life, and I always have. That's important because what happened to me on New Year's Eve wasn't the product of alcohol, exhaustion, or imagination. I was fully aware, fully sober, and painfully alert. I live on the outskirts of what most people would call a typical small southern town. The kind where everything looks normal during the day, but once the sun goes down, the long stretches of land between houses start to feel empty in a way that doesn't sit right with you. A few of my friends live even farther out, past the point where streetlights stop appearing and cell service becomes unreliable. One of those friends is Darren. Darren's family lives in a wealthy neighborhood that's tucked deep into the woods. The only way to reach it is by driving down a network of narrow country back roads that twist through dense tree lines. Every year, without fail, his parents host a New Year's Eve party. Friends, family, neighbors, everyone's invited. It's always something I look forward to. They even send formal invitations in the mail, which makes the whole thing feel more special than it probably is. That year, winter had arrived late. Typical southern weather. It stayed warm longer than usual, and then, just a few days before New Year's Eve, the temperature dropped sharply. The air had that sharp bite to it, the kind that dries your throat and makes every breath feel heavier. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly as I drove out toward Darren's place. The road was rough, uneven, and poorly maintained. Normally, I avoid using my high beams because I hate being blinded by other drivers who leave theirs on, but that night, I didn't have much of a choice. The darkness was overwhelming. Even with my brights on, the road ahead seemed to swallow the light. Trees pressed in on both sides, their bare branches forming jagged shapes against the night sky. There were no houses, no driveways, no signs of life, nothing. Just road, forest, and silence. Almost nothing. There was one structure on that stretch of road that always unsettled me. About halfway between the turnoff and Darren's neighborhood stood an old shack. It looked abandoned, weathered wood, crooked frame, windows darkened with grime. I'd passed it dozens of times over the years. Most nights it looked completely dead, but every once in a while, I swore I could see a faint light glowing from inside like someone was moving around in there. I told myself it was probably just reflection, or my eyes playing tricks on me. That night, as I drove past the shack and continued down the road, I felt that same uneasy awareness creeping in. The kind that makes you feel watched, even when you know there's no logical reason for it. A few minutes later, on a particularly straight stretch of road, my headlights caught something ahead. At first, it just looked like a patch of white among the trees, something that didn't belong there. As I got closer, the shape became clearer, tall, thin, unmistakably human. Someone was standing on the side of the road. They weren't moving, not stepping out, not waving, not even shifting their weight. Just standing there, perfectly still, with their back against the tree line. It was a woman. She was wearing a long white dress, or maybe a gown. Something that looked completely wrong for the weather. I kept my high beams on, partly out of caution and partly because I was afraid of losing sight of her for even a second. The glare made it hard to see her face, but I could tell she wasn't reacting to the lights at all. As I passed her, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel in my throat. I remember thinking how lucky I was that she didn't step into the road, that I didn't have to slow down or stop. But as soon as she was behind me, a new thought hit me. Should I have stopped? What if she needed help? What if she was another guest trying to find Darren's house and had gotten lost? The thought nagged at me just enough that I glanced in my rearview mirror. That's when I saw her move. She hadn't followed me. She hadn't stepped forward. Instead, she had turned her body slowly, deliberately, to face the direction I was going. She remained rooted to that same spot, just standing there, watching me drive away. Something about that broke whatever sympathy I'd been feeling. I pressed harder on the gas. The rest of the drive passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the image of her standing there in the road. I arrived at Darren's house around 8 p.m. The place was already alive with noise and light. Cars filled the gravel circle out front, and laughter spilled out through the open doors. Being around people helped. The warmth, the music, the conversations, it all made what I'd seen feel distant, almost unreal. The night went on as it always did. We watched the ball drop in New York, then waited for our own time zone to hit midnight. Eventually, people began filtering out, one by one. I stayed later than most, helping Darren's parents clean up like I usually did. By the time I finally left, my car was the only one still parked out front. When I started the engine, a warning light popped up on the dashboard. Low tire pressure. My car was older, so it didn't tell me which tire, just that something was off. Normally, that would have sent me into a mild panic, but I remembered how cold weather can mess with tire pressure, especially after a long, warm spell. I convinced myself I'd be fine. Still, as I sat there, I thought about the woman on the road. Was she still out there? There was another route home I could take, longer but safer. It would add about 20 minutes to the drive, and at that hour, with drunk drivers likely on the roads, I didn't want to risk it. So I took the same road back. That was a mistake. Not even 5 minutes into the drive, something felt wrong. I could hear it before I felt it, a grinding, scraping sound that didn't belong. The steering wheel vibrated slightly under my hands. Then the car slowed, no matter how much pressure I put on the gas. Finally, it rolled to a complete stop. I just sat there for a second, staring ahead into the darkness, my mind racing. Against my better judgment, I got out of the car to see what was wrong. The moment I shut the door, the headlights cut off automatically. The darkness swallowed me. Using my phone's flashlight, I walked around the car. What I saw made my stomach drop. All 4 tires were destroyed. Not flat, not punctured, shredded. The rubber was torn apart, hanging in jagged strips, like something had clawed through them. There was no way this was an accident. No way road damage had done this. This was deliberate. I stood there, completely alone, with no cell service and no way to move my car. That's when the forest went silent. The wind stopped. The branches froze. Even the faint sounds of wildlife disappeared. The sudden absence of noise was almost painful. Then I heard a twig snap, somewhere in the trees. I turned my phone light off instantly, plunging everything back into darkness. Leaves rustled. Slow. Purposeful. Then a voice spoke. "I see you." It was soft. Calm. Female. Close. My entire body locked up. I couldn't scream. I could barely breathe. "Can you see me?" I didn't think. I just turned my phone light back on. Standing at the edge of the tree line was the woman in white. Up close, she was worse than anything I'd imagined. The gown was filthy, stained dark. Her skin was unnaturally pale, stretched tight over a thin frame. Her gray hair hung in tangled clumps. And her face, it looked like half of it was missing, as if her jaw had been torn away. And yet, she was smiling. I ran. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed. I don't know how long it took, but somehow I made it back to Darren's house. They let me in immediately. They called the police and a tow truck. I stayed the night. At 3:14 a.m., I woke up to tapping on the window. A familiar voice whispered from outside. "I see you." In the morning, the woman was gone. In the yard, Darren's father found a large, rusty knife. The police later searched the shack. No one was living there, but they found dead, mutilated animals scattered throughout the woods. She was never found. I was 26 years old when this happened, and I remember that detail clearly because it was the first time I'd ever traveled alone that far without any kind of safety net. No family nearby. No friends waiting at the airport. Just me, my suitcase, and the confidence that comes from believing nothing bad will ever actually happen to you. I had flown to San Diego to visit a friend for a few days. It was a short trip, nothing dramatic, and by the time it ended, I was already exhausted. My return flight was scheduled late at night, and when the plane finally touched down back home, it was just past midnight. Airports feel different at that hour. Everything is quieter, slower, almost hollow. The crowds thin out, shops close, and the people you do see seem half awake, moving on autopilot. By the time I grabbed my bag and made my way outside to ground transportation, it was around 12:30 a.m. I didn't feel like waiting around for an Uber. My phone battery was low, and honestly, I just wanted to get home and sleep in my own bed. I walked over to the taxi pickup area and waved down one of the vans waiting there. The driver rolled down his window and asked where I was headed. I gave him my address, and without hesitation, he said he'd take me for $30. That alone felt like a win. It was cheaper than any rideshare estimate I'd seen. He got out of the van to help with my luggage. I told him it was fine, but he insisted, lifting my bag and placing on the seat behind him on the left side. I slid into the seat diagonal from him, buckled in, and watched as he pulled up directions on his phone. We pulled away from the airport and merged onto the highway almost immediately. At that hour, the roads were empty. No traffic, no congestion, just long stretches of asphalt lit by passing streetlights. A few minutes into the drive, I caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought nothing of it. Drivers check mirrors all the time. But then it happened again. Longer this time. His eyes lingered, studying me instead of the road. He finally spoke. "So, where are you coming from tonight?" "San Diego," I replied. "Oh," he said, smiling slightly. "Very nice." There was a pause, and then he asked what I had been doing there. I told him the truth, visiting a friend for a few days. That's when his tone shifted. "Is your friend as pretty as you?" The question caught me off guard. My first instinct was to laugh it off, which I did, but the feeling that followed wasn't amusement. It was discomfort. Something about the way he said it felt off. Too familiar. Too personal. From there, the questions kept coming. "What's a pretty girl like you doing traveling all by yourself?" I responded with a bit of attitude, reminding him that I just said I was visiting a friend. He countered by saying that flying alone still counted as traveling alone. I told him we could agree to disagree. He laughed and said he was just teasing. But I couldn't ignore the fact that this man was at least in his mid-40s and had known me for less than 10 minutes. The conversation felt one-sided and invasive, like he was testing boundaries to see how much I'd tolerate. The highway stretched on ahead of us, empty and dark. Eventually, I noticed a familiar overpass coming into view, the one right before my exit. I waited for him to slow down. He didn't. We passed my exit at full speed. "That was my exit," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He apologized quickly and said he'd take the next one. I leaned forward slightly, trying to glance at his phone to make sure he had the right address pulled up, but the screen was angled away from me. The next exit was about a mile up the road. As we approached it, I spoke louder. "You need to get off here." He didn't respond right away. Then, without looking at me, he turned on his blinker and exited the highway. I caught his eyes in the mirror again. This time, his expression was different. Annoyed. It faded almost instantly, replaced by that same casual smile, and not even a minute later, he asked me if I had a boyfriend. "Yes," I replied immediately. "He lives with me." He glanced at me again, and I could tell my quick response hadn't gone unnoticed. "What's his name?" he asked. That was it. That question sent a chill through me. It didn't feel like flirting anymore. It felt like interrogation. I told him I was going to put my headphones in, even though my AirPods were nearly dead. I needed him to stop talking. I needed space. Silence. I texted my family and a few close friends, telling them I was in a taxi that was making me uncomfortable. I shared my location just in case. By the time we reached my town, it was close to 1 a.m. The streets were empty. No other cars. No pedestrians. We stopped at a red light, and I looked up into the mirror. All I could see were his eyes. They weren't curious anymore. They were fixed, intense, watching me like I was something he owned. The light turned green. He didn't move. I had to tell him it was green before he finally pressed the gas. My brother was the only one responding to my messages, but he lived 2 hours away. He told me that if I felt unsafe, I should leave the car as soon as I had the chance. Another red light. Another long stare through the mirror. That's when I saw it. A police car parked in an empty lot just ahead of us. I didn't think. I reacted. I grabbed my bag and slid the van door open. The driver immediately started yelling, demanding to know what I was doing. I heard him hit the power button to close the door, but I forced it back open and jumped out the second there was enough space. I ran, straight toward the police car. The taxi didn't follow me. It didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It just drove away. That alone told me everything I needed to know. The officer noticed me almost immediately. I told him I felt unsafe and had left the taxi for my own protection. I asked if he could take me home. He said yes. The ride home took less than 10 minutes. I thanked him repeatedly, let myself into my apartment, locked the door, and went straight to bed without even unpacking. I was just starting to drift off when I heard knocking. At my front door. Slow. Deliberate. My heart started racing. The taxi driver had my address. The knocking stopped, then started again a few minutes later. I stayed frozen in bed until it finally ended. The next day at work, my neighbor called me. He said my dad had been there earlier, trying to get into my apartment. My dad was at work. That night, I returned home to pack my things. Something felt wrong. I heard creaking in the hallway. Then a voice. I wasn't going to hurt you. An arm appeared from behind the wall. I ran. Police found the back door open. No one was ever caught. I've worked overnight jobs for most of my adult life, so being awake when the rest of the world is asleep never really bothered me. If anything, I preferred it. Fewer people, fewer problems. That mindset is exactly why I didn't question taking the night shift at a small storage facility on the outskirts of town. The place wasn't huge. Just rows of metal storage units, a small office near the front gate, and a chain-link fence surrounding the property. During the day, it was boring. At night, it was silent. Too silent. I was hired mainly for security. Sit in the office, watch the cameras, make sure nobody breaks in or causes trouble. Most nights passed without incident. Occasionally, someone would show up late to grab something from their unit, but it was rare. The official closing time was 10 p.m., and after that, the gate was supposed to stay locked. This happened during my 3rd month on the job. It was late October, one of those nights where the cold creeps in quietly. Around 1:30 a.m., I was sitting at the desk scrolling through my phone when I noticed movement on one of the camera feeds. Row C. At first, I assumed it was a glitch. The cameras weren't great, and sometimes bugs or falling leaves would trigger motion alerts. But when I leaned closer to the monitor, I could clearly see a person standing between 2 units. They weren't near the gate. They were deep inside the facility. I checked the sign-in log. No one had entered since before closing. The gate was still locked, according to the front camera. That meant whoever this was had either been hiding on the property all night or had climbed the fence. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me immediately, the kind that makes your lungs sting. I walked slowly toward row C, my footsteps echoing off the metal units. The farther I went, the more uneasy I felt. Sound travels strangely in places like that. Every small noise feels amplified, like it's coming from everywhere at once. When I reached the row, I stopped. There was no one there. I scanned the area, shining my flashlight down the narrow corridor between units. Empty. I told myself they must have slipped away when they heard me coming. Still, something felt off. As I turned back toward the office, I heard a sound behind me. Metal scraping against metal. I froze. It came again, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingers across the corrugated steel of a storage door. I spun around, flashlight raised. Nothing. I hurried back to the office and locked the door behind me, my heart pounding harder than it should have been. I pulled up the camera feed again. Row C was empty, but row D wasn't. Someone was standing directly in front of the camera now, so close that their face filled most of the screen. The image was grainy, but I could tell it was a man. His head was tilted slightly, like he was studying the lens. Then he smiled. I reached for the phone to call my supervisor, but before I could dial, the screen went black. All the cameras cut out at once. The office lights flickered. I remember whispering, "Nope," under my breath, already reaching for my keys. But before I could move, there was a knock on the office door. Soft, polite. I didn't answer. Another knock. "I know you're in there," a man's voice said, calm and steady. My throat went dry. I stayed silent, barely breathing. The knock turned into tapping, fingertips drumming lightly against the glass. "You can just open the door," he continued. "I just need to get something from my unit." I finally found my voice. "We're closed," I said. "You need to leave." There was a pause. Then he laughed. "That's funny," he said, "because I've been here all night." The tapping stopped. I watched the door, waiting for something to happen. Seconds stretched into minutes. Just when I thought he might have left, the lights went out completely. The office was plunged into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The beam landed on the glass door, just in time to see a face pressed against it. His eyes were wide, unblinking. "I can see you," he whispered. I don't remember deciding to run. I just did. I burst out the back door of the office and sprinted toward the fence, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from him. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow but steady, like he knew I couldn't get far. I made it over the fence somehow, tearing my jacket and scraping my hands in the process. I didn't stop running until I reached the road and flagged down the first car I saw. Police searched the facility later that night. They didn't find anyone, but they did find something else. Inside one of the units in row C, they found blankets, empty food containers, and dozens of photographs. All of me, taken through the office window. Some data weeks back. I never planned on working night security. It wasn't a career goal or anything I'd imagined myself doing long term. I just needed money, and the pay was better than most entry-level jobs in my area. The listing made it sound easy enough. Overnight security guard at a closed manufacturing warehouse on the edge of an industrial park. Sit in a booth, monitor cameras, make hourly patrols, call the police if something looked wrong. I told myself I could handle a little boredom. The warehouse sat far away from residential areas, surrounded by unused lots and half-lit roads that barely saw traffic after dark. During the day, it looked unremarkable, just a massive concrete building with loading docks and faded company logos still visible on the side. At night, it felt like a different place entirely. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I worked alone. No supervisor on site. No co-workers. Just me, a radio that barely worked, and a set of cameras that covered most, but not all, of the property. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most nights scrolling through my phone, sipping bad coffee, and walking the same predictable patrol route. The quiet actually became comforting, until the noises started. At first, it was small things. Footsteps echoing faintly in the distance. A metallic clang from inside the warehouse that I chalked up to temperature changes. Old buildings make sounds, especially at night. That's why I kept telling myself. One night, around 2:40 a.m., I noticed something odd on one of the exterior cameras. The feed showed the far loading dock, the one that hadn't been used in years. The motion sensor had triggered. I leaned closer to the screen. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed movement near the shadows under the dock overhang. Someone was standing there, partially hidden. I checked the access log. No authorized entries since before midnight. The gates were still locked. I radioed in, expecting static. Nothing. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of oil and rust. My boots echoed loudly against the concrete as I approached the loading dock. The closer I got, the more aware I became of how exposed I was. No cover. No backup. Security, I called out. This is private property. No response. I rounded the corner of the dock, flashlight sweeping back and forth. Empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and turned back toward the booth. Halfway there, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. A slow clap. Once. Twice. 3 times. It echoed unnaturally across the open space. I spun around, heart racing, flashlight trained on the darkness. Very brave. A man's voice said from somewhere behind the dock. I didn't see him. You shouldn't be back here, I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to steady it. He laughed softly. That's funny, he replied. I was thinking the same thing about you. I backed away slowly, never turning my back, until I reached the booth and locked myself inside. My hands were shaking as I checked the cameras. The man was gone. Every exterior feed showed nothing unusual. I tried calling the non-emergency police line, but the call wouldn't go through. The radio crackled once, then went silent again. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched the entire time. The next night, it happened again. Motion alert at the same loading dock. Same time. This time, I didn't go outside. I watched the camera feed closely. The figure stepped fully into view. It was the same man. He was tall, thin, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. He stood perfectly still, staring directly into the camera. Slowly, he raised his hand and waved. Then the feed cut to static. One by one, the other cameras went offline. The lights inside the booth flickered. Then the knocking started. Not frantic, not aggressive. Polite. Measured. like someone knocking on a neighbor's door. I know you're in there, the man said calmly. You should really answer. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching my flashlight like it could save me. You didn't call the police last night, he continued. I was hoping you would. The door handle rattled. I just want to talk. The power went out. Total darkness. I heard footsteps circling the booth. Slow, unhurried. The sound of someone dragging their fingers along the glass. I can hear your breathing, he whispered. Something slammed against the door. I screamed. The next thing I remember is blinding headlights and someone shouting my name. Police cars. The man was gone. They searched the property, but found no trace of him. Except one thing. Scratched into the dust beneath the loading dock were the words, "See you tomorrow." I never went back.